I now invite Dr. Anwar Sadat, Director of Iqsc, to enlighten all of us about the today's conference.
Honorable Principal, Dr. Bashir Ahmed, respected Vice Principal, Professor S.A. Sheikh Mohammed, Head of the Department, Professor Saeed Sarmat Ahmed, Shift to Head in Charge, Dr. A.K. Muhammad Ali, other officials, distinguished resource persons, delegates, my learned colleagues, members of the Alpha Academy, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a warm good morning to everyone present in this conference. I am delighted to speak on the theme of this conference. The principal, in his inaugural address, clarified the foundations of our interest in cultural studies, and the seminars and conferences on issues associated with literature and culture previously conducted by our department. This conference is relatively wider in its scope as it encourages critiques of cultural representations in any literary work published in the 21st century. Taking the spirit of multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and cultural globalization in a positive note, this conference did not demarcate any geographical boundaries for choosing literary works for paper presentations. At the core of the conceptual framework of the conference is the necessity to address the representational potential of literature in general and the literary representations of specific cultural groups in particular. Further, the politics of rummaging the fabric of cultures represented by writers in their works is also expected to be problematized by the paper presenters. Neither noteworthy aim of this conference is to promote the use of diverse theoretical positions in cultural studies in examining literary works published in the 21st century. Yet another guiding force for this conference is the realization of the growing importance of humanities in these changing times. In the context of the still continuing rampant new forms of domination as well as demonization of certain cultures and groups, in spite of the other advances human societies have achieved, it becomes essential to encourage close critical readings that would help us in defending and sustaining the core values enshrined in democracy and secularism. As M.A.R. Habib rightly cautioned us, I quote, "We cannot be good citizens either of a particular country or of the world by succumbing to endless forces operating worldwide that encourage us to remain ignorant, to follow blindly, whether in the form of blind nationalism, blind religiosity, blind chauvinism in all its manifold guises." One of the keys to counteracting those forces which would keep us in darkness lies in education, and in particular in the process which forms the core of education, the individual and institutional practices of reading, of close, careful, critical reading. Such reading entails a great deal more than merely close attention to the words on the page or on the text, as it immediately confronts us. M.A.R. Habib further adds that all disciplines, I quote, in the humanities call for such close, critical, and comprehensive reading. There is one discipline which is defined by its insistence on such strategies. That is the discipline of literary criticism as operating through both practice and theory, unquote. Although the discussions on cultural representations often become deliberations on the treatment in literature of minor or sidelined classes, races, ethnicities, and genders as affected by the hegemonic system of domination, the scope of cultural studies is far beyond this. Alongside its general tendency to address minority discourse, cultural studies of literature often percolates deep into the recesses of cultural relations on the one hand, and closely examines the emergence of new ethnicities, crypto-ethnicities, and subcultures in the margins of minor or major groups during diverse historical circumstances, like diasporic movement of people, ghettoization and racial profiling of communities, and partial assimilation of minor groups into the mainstream. Therefore, it is apparent that the scope of today's conference is pretty wide. I would also briefly mention the emergence of cultural studies as a literary theory or a conglomeration of theoretical positions that deal with culture as the primary category. Although literature has been looked at diversely through the lens of literary theory from the late 1960s, explication of literary texts assumed an unprecedented openness and flexibility with the intervention of cultural studies. Primarily, cultural studies liberates literature students from the constrictions imposed by the disciplinary boundaries. Perhaps this process began when the formalist readings that confined the orientation of literary study within the text, that was eased by the flooding of theories and approaches that heralded the onset of a sociological turn in literary studies. And this has encouraged critics to be extended outside the text. It is significant here that even though we mark the series of lectures delivered by Stuart Hall in the University of Illinois in 1983 as the point of recognition of cultural studies as a school in literary theory, dealing with, in quotes, experience lived, experience interpreted, experience defined. Most of the views presented by Stuart Hall were part of earlier contemporary theories like Marxism, feminism, new historicism, post-structuralism, and postmodernism. For instance, Stuart Hall's division between the authenticated, validated, within quotes, tastes of the upper classes and the so-called unrefined cultures of the masses was, in fact, an extension of the postmodern repugnance of the division between high culture and pop arts. In fact, Stuart Hall gave these ideas a new dimension when he argued that popular culture is one of the sites where this struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle, unquote. And it is the arena of consent and resistance. Likewise, cultural studies owes much to Marxist literary theory, the Foucauldian deconstructions of French history, the feminist contestations of the operations of anthropocratic societies, and they may thus be considered as significant precursor movements to cultural studies. Perhaps all the theoretical approaches that legitimize the need to look outside the text, the historical, political conditions in which books are written, books are read and critiqued, can be considered as precursors of cultural studies. Today, we students of literature consider cultural studies as a compendium of tools and approaches that enables us to read dimensions of the broad realm of culture in literary texts. To conclude my talk, the renewed openness of reading without the expectations of a transcendental signified is arguably characteristic of humanities in general. As long as the scope of interpretations is as broad as the scope of human mind itself, which defies all demarcations. Despite the fact that the multiplicity of theoretical approaches enables the proliferation of what Harold Bloom called elsewhere as deliberate misreadings, they apparently open up new possibilities for literature and literary studies. As Elif Shafak, the famous Turkish novelist, said in one of her speeches, we tend to form clusters based on similarity, and then we produce stereotypes about other clusters of people. In my opinion, one of the way of transcending these cultural ghettos is through the art of storytelling. Stories cannot demolish frontiers, but they can punch holes in our mental walls. And through these holes, we can get a glimpse of the other and sometimes even like what we see. Unquote. Elif Shafak's statement is probably applicable not only to storytelling, but also to all critical readings. Thus, close critical readings of literature punch holes in our mental walls. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for highlighting the importance and relevance of the theme of today's conference.